Hi everyone, this is Ron Beghetto. I wish I could be joining everyone for this panel on our new book, Dynamic Perspectives on Creativity. I just want to give a quick overview of the project that resulted in this book and then dive into the chapter that I contributed with Maciek Karwalski. So when Giovanni and I first started talking about this, kind of the genesis of this project, he had been doing work on conceptualizing creativity as a dynamic phenomenon, and we had a conversation about that. His article had just come out in the Creativity Research Journal, and I had been doing work thinking about more dynamic ways to assess and measure and conceptualize creativity, particularly in educational settings. So thinking about the idea that, self-beliefs, for example, aren't just these kind of static beliefs, but they change depending on the context and the situation. And also that educational settings themselves are very dynamic and volatile places. Even though they're planned environments, there's always these kind of emergent and unexpected aspects to them, including in kind of more micro moment ways where we're having classroom discussions. So how do we kind of identify, represent the kinds of things that happen, like in a class discussion, how ideas kind of emerge and change over the course of a conversation, which ideas get picked up, which ones get suspended or dismissed and reanimated. So those kinds of things I had been wrestling with and thinking about methodological approaches for that, as well as just the nature of creativity itself, that it is something that isn't always fixed. And I love Giovanni's concept of inconclusiveness, that even when we determine something's creative, it still can change. So it's under that context that we put together this volume, and we're really excited about all the contributors' work in this volume. It ranges everything from more speculative essays to theoretical pieces and even some empirical work being reported in here. And I think you'll see that represented in the talks of this particular panel. So without further ado, I'm going to dive into my chapter, which is chapter 2. And again, I wrote this with Maciek Karwalski. We've been doing a lot of work thinking about dynamic and micro-longitudinal approaches to creativity. And so as we talk about in this chapter, researchers have conceptualized and studied creativity in a variety of different ways, but one common theme is that we often tend to think about creative thought, or treat it anyway, as if it is a static phenomenon, and we assess it with kind of fixed measures. And we're not saying that those measures lack value, but we maintain that it can only provide a limited insights into the kind of dynamic and multifaceted nature of creative phenomena. So we argue that we need a more dynamic and micro-longitudinal approach to studying creativity in classrooms. So that's kind of what this chapter is about. And so as we enter this chapter, we outline some basic assumptions, and we think this is really important to do, especially as the field of creativity studies is continuing to expand, that we continually revisit what are our assumptions that we're operating from. So one of our first assumptions is that creative endeavors always involve some level of uncertainty, because otherwise, if you know what the outcome of an action is in advance, then the result can hardly be called creative. So we give an example in there of like the musical arts. A musician who's writing a composition starts at the point of uncertainty. The musician doesn't know exactly how the composition is going to take shape until it's actually finished. And then even when the composition is finished, opportunities for creative expression are somewhat limited, but not entirely eliminated. So this goes back to Giovanni's idea of inconclusiveness. And so performers can introduce additional uncertainty by experimenting with their own unique interpretations or adding their own novel flourishes when playing the piece. So in this way, uncertainty serves as a catalyst and a condition for creativity. The second one is creative thought and action result from a dynamic and emergent process. So creative resolution of uncertainty is dynamic and emergent because both the process and the outcomes of creative thought and action change and take shape over time. The third assumption is determinations about creativity are based on generally agreed upon criteria. Many of you may already be aware of this, but in most cases, creativity researchers typically outline two criteria. One is originality, that it requires originality, but also usefulness or meaningfulness or meeting task constraints within a particular context. And so that leads us to our final assumption, which is judgments about creativity are dynamic and subject to change across time and context. So what are the implications for research? Well, when we were thinking about this, we recognized that, although creativity researchers have been conceptualizing creativity in a variety of different ways, and some of them have kind of had a more dynamic view of creativity and conceptualizing it as involving various forms of processes and so on. Oftentimes the way we approach it in our research designs and our methods and our analytic techniques is to still treat it pretty much as a static construct. Just measure it with surveys or single measures or even a variety of measures, but measures that are still fairly static. So what we propose in this chapter is one approach, a micro-longitudinal approach, which allows researchers to try to represent the more dynamic nature of creative phenomena, particularly in educational settings. And so a micro-longitudinal approach, the way we define that is a measurement approach that takes measurements at more rapid intervals, like milliseconds, seconds, minutes, and in this way more dynamically captures or represents the more ephemeral phenomena of creativity so that we can record it, analyze it, and interpret it. And you can, of course, use this with both qualitative and quantitative data sources. And so we're going to give you a couple examples of what this looks like, including some from our own research. And so first we'll start with kind of the qualitative interpretive example. So researchers using this approach can use this to kind of analyze and represent different patterns of interactions amongst students and teachers, particularly during class discussions. And so in doing that, you can kind of explain classroom level variations in creative expression within and across classrooms. So here's an example of a visual display that allows researchers to kind of look at this. And this is from a study that we completed and published in 2016. And this is a way to represent these different intervals of time. So that horizontal line are different kind of turns in a dialogue. And you can see that the teacher asks a question which moves into a more indeterminate or uncertain state. And then as a student responds in an expected way, that moves more into kind of a determinate state, and it's accepted. That little a is an accepted. So you can see the basic pattern of talk in this particular classroom, which, by the way, is a classroom that was classified as having a negative relationship between academic achievement and creative expression. And so in this classroom, the teacher would ask a question, the student would respond, the teacher would accept it and move on to a new question. So you can kind of see this very closed pattern. So in another classroom, we have a pattern of talk. This happened to be a classroom that was classified with a positive correlation between academic achievement and a measure of creativity. And so in this pattern, you see a little bit more variability here, where a teacher asks a question, a student kind of provides a response, the teacher responds to that. So there's some uncertainty in where this is headed, and ultimately it gets dismissed. Sometimes a utterance can be suspended. It's not acknowledged, so it just kind of floats out there. Other students maybe kind of respond to it, and then it just kind of hangs out there and maybe could be returned to later. And so you can see these different patterns of expression. And so even here, an idea that was accepted is later reanimated by a different student, and then it's brought into a different conversation, and then it's finally accepted and then reanimated again, and ultimately accepted. So you could see students are kind of building on each other's ideas. And so by looking at this, it's just another way of kind of capturing the dynamics of what's happening during a classroom conversation that can be used in conjunction with observations, behavioral observations of teacher behavior, student behavior, but also more static classifications like the correlations between academic achievement and creativity. So that's one example, and again, such displays highlight these kind of dynamic trajectories of potential ideas that otherwise might be missed. But then there's other ways of using dynamic approaches in more quantitative ways as well. So in addition to those kind of qualitative interpretations, you can use micro-longitudinal approaches to study things such as self-beliefs, which is something that I've always felt is much more dynamic than the way I and others have measured it. And so thinking about ways that we can kind of look at how, for example, creative confidence beliefs change and become more animated and variable within engagement on a particular task. And so this is an example that I actually designed and used to teach a workshop on thinking about the more dynamic nature of self-beliefs and other more dynamic states like emotional states and so on within the engagement of a particular task. So the idea here is you can take measurements across 3 different measurement windows. And in the first measurement window, you can assess more stable things like general or global creative confidence, any other variables you might be interested in. And then you introduce a task, and you can start kind of tracking how do confidence beliefs change over the duration of brief intervals. This could be minutes. This could be a little bit longer duration. It doesn't have to be this many kind of measurement intervals, but you want to get multiple measurement intervals so you can start seeing that within each particular individual, there are fluctuations in their confidence to complete the task, their creative confidence, but also their various emotional states. And then after the task is complete, you can kind of reassess global confidence. You can look and see, how stable is it from pre to post? Does anything that's happening in the task impact these more kind of stable beliefs? You can reassess any other secondary or tertiary variables. And so the idea here is you can get a much more vivid description of what is otherwise considered a more kind of static way of approaching psychological phenomena. So you can kind of model the more dynamic approaches. And then, of course, you need more dynamic analytic techniques to handle the data and interpret the data. And we also want to be able to model both between and within person variability in the creative process and self-assessment and self-regulation. And from a theoretical standpoint, being less focused on differences between people and more on the intra-individual or within-person differences. And so multi-level models are a particularly robust approach for doing this because they can take into account the nested structure of data. And when participants provide, several self-evaluations during a problem-solving session, just like we saw here, then you can start modeling not only the average level of a person's creative confidence overall, but also the variability within these intrapersonal changes. In a recent study that's in press now, we were able to use a cross-lag model here and look at, as creative confidence went up, so did positive emotions. And so we were able to kind of look at those cross-lag effects or chicken and egg problems. Also, latent growth curve modeling is another powerful technique that we can use to address questions such as, does creative confidence increase or decrease while handling a creative task? Perhaps it follows a curvilinear trend. Maybe there's a high level of creative confidence from pre-test, and it starts decreasing during the task, then increases. So we can see some of this happening in this kind of hypothetical example. And you can start looking at estimates of overall patterns, kind of the shape and the level, the percentage of variation of intra-individual changes, and including intrapersonal and interpersonal factors that can maybe help explain that variability. And just another one we highlight in the chapter is the idea of perhaps using even network-based analysis, which typically isn't used in more dynamic ways. But it is possible to model the dynamics of relationships between different characteristics in a both between subject and within subject way using these kind of network-based models. So while the between subject network can illustrate dynamics that involve more stable or trait-like characteristics, the kind of more within subject networks can show links between the momentary levels of individual characteristics, for example, moment-to-moment or problem-to-problem creative confidence or affect. And so we provide an example and discuss that example in the chapter. So in conclusion, our central argument in this chapter is that creative phenomena in classrooms, like all other contexts, is dynamic and therefore needs to be treated as such by researchers. And although traditional static approaches have provided some glimpse into creative expression, we now have the theoretical, methodological, and analytic basis for approaching creative expression more dynamically. Thank you.